Welcome to my Traveling Color Studio. I'm Brienne M Brown, and I'm excited to share with you a tool that I learned several years ago that helped me understand watercolor better. And I like to share this in all my workshops and lessons that I teach. So what is it? It's about paint consistency, okay? And that paint consistency is the ratio between pigment and water in your brush. And it is key to really being able to work with watercolor and be more confident when you paint, okay? So several years ago, I was taking a workshop from Jana Winter Parkins, and she taught this to me. And I've also later seen that Joseph Zubovic has a book out which explains this analogy, okay, in how to understand paint consistency. And he uses the analogy of tea to butter, okay? And it helps us visualize what this paint consistency is. It took me, after learning it from my instructor, it took me about a year to practice it and really being able to use it. But I'm going to show you what it is today. So let me explain about paint consistency. It has to do with how much water versus pigment that is in your brush. Okay, so in order to explain this, we're going to do the tea to butter analogy. So you should do this along with me. You're going to make 5 squares. They do not have to be perfect. Mine hardly ever are. Okay, so we're going to start out with tea. So this is going to be a spectrum of a lot of water to a lot of pigment. Okay? With tea, you can think of steeped tea. So you have a lot of water, it's really washy, and there's a little bit of pigment, but there should still be enough pigment to see the color. Then there's coffee. All right, and that has a little more body to it, okay? But it's still watery, and with either of these you can do a wash. Okay, and then there's milk, and I'm talking about whole milk. So now it's thicker, it's got more pigment, but it's still easy to paint on. Okay, and then there's cream, favorite stage. With cream, this is where your darks are going to come in, okay? And that's got a lot of pigment, just a little bit in your brush, a little bit of water in your brush. And then there's butter, okay? And butter should be used sparingly, and it's basically right out of the tube, okay, with hardly any water in your brush. I think the best way to explain it is to show you. First of all, I just got a scrap piece of paper. You don't have to tape it. I just like to work on the board. I'm always working at least a 30-degree angle with my board, okay? Okay, you're going to use any kind of neutral dark pigment. I'm just going to use Payne's Gray. You could use neutral tint, black, something like that. I do that over a color. If you are going to use a color, use a dark one like purple or blue, because it's easier to see. But this, of course, can be done with any color. Okay, so you're going to grab some pigment here. I'm using a flat brush. I don't paint a lot with flat brushes. You can use any type of brush is fine, it will work. If you use squirrel mops, which I do for my washes, it's great for the tea to coffee, but harder to get the other ones because it's hard to get water out of the brush, okay? So any brush is fine. So here you can see I'm getting quite a bit of pigment, enough so that I can see it, but then lots of water. Okay, now look how washy this is. It's important to look at my palette, because that's how I tell what the consistency is. Okay, it's easiest to tell. See how it moves and flows very, very easily. Okay, this is tea. And this is great for washes. I'm gonna go ahead and color in the T-square. It's kind of funny. And you see how it easily beads up, okay? So that is T, and we can pick up that bead so that it won't cause havoc. Okay, but I can still see color, okay? But it's very, very light. Now, coffee can also be used for a wash, but I'm just gonna grab more pigment here so that it's darker. More pigment usually means darker value, but not always. I'll talk about that in a minute. But see how it's still really watery and washy? Okay, we'll get just a little bit more. Still really watery and washy, okay, and so you could still, it still flows very easily on the palette. You could still do a wash with this. All right, see how it still beads up very nicely. Oh, maybe needs a little more pigment. Okay, there's a range in here too, you know, of how much pigment you're gonna use. But there we go, that looks good. All right, so there's more pigment in here than here, so this ends up being darker. Okay, so now let's go into the milk. All right, I'm gonna do it in a different section on my palette. Okay, I'm gonna grab some pigment here. This is one reason why I like tube paints. Grab some water from my coffee pile there. Because with pan paints, it's really hard to get as much pigment out of them. I find that the tube paints are easier, and when they're tacky, they work great. If your watercolors have hardened to little pebbles, it's dead. Throw it away. Get some fresh paint out. Okay? The best is to have the paint kind of tacky. Okay, so look at this pile here. This is going to be my milk. You see how it still flows? But it's not as quick and fast as this one over here. But it's still flowing, okay? It's just slow. All right, that way I know I have enough water out of it and more pigment. So again, we've gotten a little darker here. Pick up that, but still very easy to paint, but you really can't do a wash with this, okay? There's not enough water to get a good wash in. All right, so that's milk. Now cream, even more pigment, and you also want to kind of get a lot of the main water out of your brush by just putting a paper towel near the ferrule, okay, and that'll soak up enough of the water. Okay, but this should still be easy to flow. But now here's a key piece. So here's my cream pile. It's not moving at all. This one's still flowing slightly. This one's not moving at all unless I move it. Okay, that is a key piece. Now look how dark that is. Okay, almost hard to, should still be able to paint though, still be able to cover a nice area. But look how dark that is. Now it's because, why is this so? It's because you have enough pigment now to cover the paper. So here's a key piece. Think about what the main difference, or there's a couple differences, but one difference between oils and watercolors, to make a color light, we don't add white, we add water. Why? Well, because of the transparent nature of watercolor, when we add water, some of the white paper shows through, so lightening the color. More pigment we add, it covers up more of that paper. So we need enough pigment to cover up this white to get dark enough. A lot of people ask me, how do I get that big contrast between my lights and darks? It's because I get to the cream. A lot of students don't quite get to milk to cream, and so they can't quite get dark enough, and their painting ends up working in this area. And they try to get darker by glazing and glazing and glazing, and that is just, I think, harder and harder to get dark and not get muddy, because then the more you go over it, the more you glaze, the easier it is to get mud. Okay, so let's go into what butter is. Okay, butter, I am going to clean my brush and then also get most of the water out of it that I can. And it's going to be straight from the tube. Now, my paints are tacky enough, I can get it right from here. But it's not going, butter is not going to paint on very well, okay? Now, what's this used for? I don't do my darks in here. I do my darks with cream. So what is this butter for? Well, I use it for highlights when I use white paint, you know, gouache. Or you can also use it, it's great for putting into a wet area, and it does different things. Or sometimes you want a dry brush effect, okay, with the thick paint. So there's a couple reasons for it. This is a fairly simple concept, and as far as to explain, okay? All right, you've got lots of water to lots of pigment, and there's a range in between. When I first learned this, it was kind of like an eye-opener, like, oh, I didn't even think about this. And with a lot of other painting, you don't necessarily have to think about the consistency. But with watercolor, this is essential, okay? And let me show you why. So, there are actually a couple reasons. One is, so I get my lights, from tea to coffee is where my light values come from. My mid values come from coffee and milk. All right? And my dark values are from milk to cream. I can't write here apparently. Okay. And so why do I have a range here? Well, you also have to think about the color itself, right? Some colors are darker than others. It's a range, but you want to think about it as pigment versus water. It's paint consistency. It doesn't always equate to value, though most often it does. Like for instance, we could do this with yellow and you can have this paint consistency range, but you're not going to see much of a value range. Okay, so that's one reason I like to focus on, think of it as paint consistency, but it does oftentimes equate to value. Okay, all right, so now that we've got this and practiced this, I mean, it took me a year after learning it to really be able to use it, okay, within my paintings. Now, not just do we have to think about the paint consistency within our brush, we also need to think about the wetness or dampness of the paper and what these do to that. All right, so here I just have another scrap piece of paper, okay, that I'm going to use to test what these different consistencies, tea to butter, do on dry paper. I'm gonna go ahead and label this. This is gonna be my dry, okay, damp, and wet. Now there's in between here too, but let's just stick with these three. Okay, so I'm going to wet these two sections and then we're going to immediately work in here. We're going to let this dry a little till it gets to damp and then we're going to work on dry last. Okay, so I'm just taking a brush and I'm just going to wet this area. The way you see if something's wet versus damp, okay, we're gonna go ahead and, so if you look on the side, you can see that it's shiny, okay, if you look at the way it's reflecting the light. Okay, so this is really shiny, the whole thing is, so that means it's wet. So let's go ahead and do some different things. So if we were gonna do something like coffee or tea in this wet area, okay, it's going to disperse really easily, okay, and gets nice and soft and stuff like that. Okay, so what if we were going to do milk to cream? Let's do cream actually. Let's see what happens with cream. Okay, It's still going to get nice and soft and get nice and soft edges, but it's not going to disperse quite as much, okay? If you have more water on the paper than you have on your brush, then it won't move as much, okay? It's basically, think about it, it's the water that's the vehicle. It's the water that's moving this pigment around, okay? And the more water you have in the brush and on the paper, the more it's going to move. And the same is true in the reverse. The less you have, the less it'll move. So let's go ahead and do some butter in this wet area. So dried my brush off, and I just got some paint right out of the tube. Now look at that, okay? Where I could barely paint with it on the dry paper, see what I can do with it when you've got water on the paper, okay? And it can give some different effects. Okay, great. Now I'm looking at this damp area. So it's the damp stage is not shiny, it's has like a satin finish you can think of. Okay, just a little bit of a sheen, but not wet. Okay, so let's do the different things here. If I do a watery one like tea to coffee, let's see what happens here. Okay, now you get a nice soft edge, but it doesn't disperse as much as this one. Okay, now also remember there's kind of a gradation here. It's going to be more wet down here than it is up here. Okay, so you can see some variations. See how this one up here is drying. It's still damp, but down here it was much wetter. And these are the type of things you want to do. So many students want to get to just painting a picture, but you've got to understand how the watercolor works, okay? That means playing with it to find out what it does, because you need all these tools in your arsenal, okay? So let's go ahead and get some cream to milk. Let's see what it does here. Now remember also, when you're going to paint on wet paper, the water's also going to dilute it more. Okay, so you get a nice soft edge, but again, it's going to stay a little more in the area than it was here. See how that continued to move? With watercolor, what you really got to be is patient. You got to see what's going to happen, because it's going to continue to move and do things you wouldn't have expected. So another reason why you've got to try these out for yourself and play with it. All right, so let's do here. Let's see, it's not quite damp. It's still pretty wet on this bottom. So let's wait just a little bit longer. That looks pretty good. So this is damp. Let's get the water out of our brush, just like this. Get some thick paint straight out of the tube. And let's see what it's going to do. Okay. Now you can pretty much, on damp paper, it's going to go hardly anywhere. All right. So most of you will know, figure out what dry is, kind of what we just did, but let's just do it in comparison. We'll go ahead and do all right, tea to coffee. You can see it's not going to move, but it's easy to do that wash, okay? So you can do an area wash with that, but keep sharp edges. Same with milk. Milk to cream, just darker. Then, and get the butter. Getting the water out of my brush. So same thing what I've done, but now of course on dry paper, you're not gonna get, there's hardly any water, so there's no place for it to go, but you can get some dry brush effects. Again, I use it for highlights and that kind of stuff, okay? But it's not going to paint as nicely as if you painted on damp or wet paper. you know, the best thing I can say is practice, practice, practice with this, okay? Until you can get it and understand it and then use it for a painting. So when you look at any of my other videos or tutorials, these are the type of terms I will use. So you'll hear me if I say, oh, this is coffee consistency, this is cream, you'll know what I'm talking about, okay?